everyone. My name is Jake. I'm the lead pastor here, and I had hoped to be able to kind of reveal this sweater, right now. Like, imagine if I was able to do a costume change. That was my hope, but this is not the kind of sweater that I can easily take on and off. Does anyone have these sweaters, right? There are sweaters that once you're in them, and that's kind of how it goes. So I couldn't do any kind of reveal, but this sweater is my way of just saying that I am leaning in to the holidays and the holiday season, right? It's already kicked off. We're already in full swing. Maybe you are leaning in. Maybe you're not ready to lean in yet. Maybe you're out there and you're thinking, it's hard to lean in to the holidays when it feels like there's so much wrong in our world, right? There's so much turmoil. That's understandable, right? We have space for that. And you might be wondering, how can I celebrate? How can I have joy in a time like this? And so what I think the good news of Christmas actually is that this holiday has, for thousands of years, been an ancient conversation on things like, how do we care for the marginalized and most vulnerable? It's been an ancient conversation on how do we address systems that in their root and in their core are systems of inequality. Right? It's been an ancient conversation on how to have hope in the darkest times of the year, but also in the darkest times of life. And it's been an ancient conversation on how the divine meets us in our humanity and in all our messiness and in all our brokenness. And so, with that, right, you might be thinking, that's not the Christmas that I've been told about for most of my life. That's not the Christmas that Coca-Cola commercials is trying to sell me. And so with that, I think there's some themes that we've missed, right, when talking about Christmas. And those are the themes that I'm excited to explore during this next series. This next series, which you might have rightfully said, quite a mouthful of a title, right? But I thought, I was kind of debating. I was going back and forth. I was like, do I do a shorter title? What's something cleaner? And then I just said, I don't care. Let's have fun. Life is short. The hidden underbelly of Christmas it is, right? So are you with me on that, okay? Right? Because there is, in fact, a hidden underbelly of the Christmas season. And I love this, I'll put that quote right back up because I think it really captures what we're talking about. Christmas is a revolution disguised as a baby shower. There's a lot of radical things in the underbelly of Christmas that I'm excited to explore over the next few weeks with you as we lead into Christmas Eve. Last year we talked about a variety of traditions and how different things that are celebrated during this time of year, things like Kwanzaa, Hanukkah, Yule. And this year, I want to come back to Christmas, but maybe turn it on its head. So, right, see it with some new eyes. And so I thought, let's start with the central figure of Christmas. The reason for the season, you all know who I'm talking about, right? Santa Claus. So I have an interesting history with Santa Claus, right? Because I remember, when I was in elementary school, we would have this choir class that we would go to once a week, and they would teach us songs, but it was through these songs that they would teach us about life. And there was this one year that we were taught Christmas songs, and these Christmas songs were kind of the weird Christmas songs. I don't know if you remember these. Like, I'm in elementary school, and they taught us "Grandma Got Run Over by a Reindeer." I still, to this day, I have not figured out the meaning and the deeper meaning of that song yet. Like, that's still a mystery to me. But there was another song that they taught us that year that really perplexed me. And this song is called "I Saw Mommy Kissing Santa Claus." Now, I was in elementary school. I was young. It went over my head. It raised a lot of really serious questions about who this Santa Claus person is. Okay, why is mom kissing Santa Claus? Does daddy know that mommy's kissing? I was just, is there some kind of arrangement here? And is this how the presents end up under the tree? Like, what is going on here? So it was a little disturbing to me, to say the least. Who is this Santa Claus guy? And then, of course, we also talk about how he sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake, right? It's 2025. It's kind of not the cultural climate for that anymore, right? You better not shout. You better not cry. You better not pout. It's like, we've been to therapy, okay? It's okay to do those things. I did all three yesterday. So it raises some questions like, who is this Santa Claus? And then also, we always talk about the saint part, Saint Nick, right? Santa, saint. And so really, how did we go from a saint to this sort of symbol of our consumption, right? And how much we buy and all the gift giving. And so I want to kind of take a journey backwards and really see how we got to our modern day Santa Claus. And we'll start in the 1930s here in America. The modern day Santa Claus comes from Coca-Cola in many ways, right? This was a symbol of marketing, right? He was in many ways, both from the attire and everything was really part of this partnership with Coca-Cola. And this Santa Claus drew upon about a century of tradition that we get from 1823, where we have the well-known book, poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas, which we often call 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, right? So that's in 1823. This story drew upon the traditions of Dutch immigrants in this country who had celebrated their figure, Sinterklaas, which is essentially the Dutch translation of Saint Nicholas, right? So this is where we start, Saint Nicholas. And of course, Klaus is another derivative of Nicholas. So next time you see your friend Nick, you can say, you might have been a Klaus, right? You could have, I'm going to call you Klaus, right? So Saint Nicholas, Santa Claus. And modern tradition really traces back to this person, St. Nicholas, who was in fact a real person, and who there are stories about, and who in many ways represented some things that I think give us a picture of some of the hidden themes of Christmas. As theologian John Dominic Cross insightfully says, if you want to recover the meaning of Christmas, start with Nicholas. He reveals that love is not an idea, but an embodied practice. So let's start with St. Nicholas. And obviously this is an old picture. I think this is an iPhone 4 picture. So bear with me. Obviously a long time ago. In fact, Nicholas pops up on the scene born in 270, the year 270, in a place that we would consider to be modern day Turkey. And similar to the Buddha, Nicholas is born into wealth, but ultimately rejects it in favor of caring for those who are suffering, caring for the poor. Nicholas was also a bishop in a time of incredible political and religious upheaval. We wouldn't know anything about political or religious upheaval in our modern day, would we? Right? Nicholas was the patron saint of children, or he is the patron saint of children, the poor and in debt, prisoners and the wrongly accused, and sailors, among many other patronages. But these are the ones he is often most well known for. And so what this means is that you think about these groups, right? Some of the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, those without safety nets, right? Those whose lives have some inherent danger to them. And these are the types of people that call upon this person as a symbol of hope and of refuge. Right? So how do we think that Nicholas becomes the patron saint of these groups? Well, I'll tell you a couple stories that we kind of get the modern day picture of Nicholas from, okay? So here are a few stories about Nicholas, right? And these stories might have evolved and changed through the years, but these are just symbols and representations of who we know him to be. The first is a story of the 3 daughters and the 3 dowries. See, in Nicholas's time, right, if you were a father and you wanted to allow your daughter to be married into another family, you needed a dowry. You needed to be able to pay a certain sum of money. And if you could not afford that, then unfortunately, the options for your daughter were horrific. It was slavery or prostitution. And so there is a family whom Nicholas recognizes, a family with 3 daughters and a father who cannot pay for their dowries. So he, in the night, throws bags of gold into their window in order to pay for the dowry and prevent this horrific outcome for these daughters. Again, it has similarities to our modern day picture of Santa Claus, right? A gift in the night in secret, right? There's this other story where Nicholas finds out that 2 men are about to be executed for a crime they are wrongly accused of. And he runs to the execution, and as the executioner is swinging their sword, he puts his hand out to stop the execution. He puts himself in the way of the violence. This is where we see that he becomes the patron saint of the prisoners and the wrongly accused. Right? He defended those who the system had and the corruption of the system had got in the way of justice. There's this other story. It's a little more abstract, a little more theological, but I think it has some real serious significance to our conversation. See, in Nicholas's time, there was this important event in church history called the Council of Nicaea. And basically what this was is in the first few centuries of the Common Era, right? In many ways, Christian tradition was still being decided upon. It was still very malleable. And so these councils would get together and they would essentially decide, how are we going to present this tradition moving forward? Who was Jesus to us? What books of the Bible are we going to include and what are we going to keep out? Right? And so it's recorded that Nicholas was a part of this very important conversation at the Council of Nicaea. And it's reported that he argued for a divine Christ. But the reason for doing this was not some abstract theological reason, but it was because this figure, this Jesus, had come from the poor, had come from the immigrant, right? He was part of the underside of society. And Nicholas believed that if you ripped the divinity from this Christ, you also took the divinity from these people, right? That for a divine Christ meant a divine poor and a divine immigrant. That really seeing the divine in Christ was seeing the divine in all. And this is why he argued for that. And so what we see from these stories of who Nicholas was someone who cared about the dignity of the poor, the dignity of the hungry, the dignity of the vulnerable, the dignity of the wrongly accused. And so in many ways, Saint Nick and this transformation into our modern day Santa Claus, it's interesting because Saint Nick in many ways is far more Mother Teresa than he is the North Pole's head toy maker. Right? He's far more Jesus than he is Rudolph or Frosty the snowman. And this idea of how Saint Nicholas leaned in toward the vulnerable is baked into Christmas, whether we realize it or not. That perhaps a hidden theme of Christmas is how we care for the most vulnerable, how we respond to injustice, and how we restore dignity to the poor and to those who are on the underside of systems of inequality in our world. Maybe this sheds some light and gives some more clarity to this Santa Claus that brings gifts in the night for children. Because children are always the most vulnerable in any society. And when you bring a gift to a child, you're not just giving them something of value, you're saying you are of value, you are worth something. Brian McLaren said, the modern Santa brings gifts, the ancient Nicholas brought dignity. Christmas needs both joy and justice to be whole again. That dignity and justice are intertwined, right? So as you think about Santa Claus coming down your chimney this year, perhaps there's also an invitation in that chimney, an invitation of a new way of seeing the world, of seeing the marginalized and vulnerable, of seeing those who have been robbed of their dignity. Perhaps that can be a new and hidden dimension of Christmas to be unlocked this year. Because St. Nicholas, he lived in a time of incredible inequality. And of course, that was 1,800 years ago. And of course, in the last 1,800 years, we have solved all inequality. We have solved all of those problems. We're good, right? Right? Am I right? No? Okay. We've had 1,800 years. But when we look at how Nicholas fed and protected, just as Jesus did, that in many ways, for every mouth that Nicholas fed, he was also challenging a system that failed to protect, that failed to feed. And so may we look not just at the individual mouths, may we zoom out and take a look at the system that is failing these people. I'll give you an example of some of the ways that we might look today and see a system that is broken. In the United States, in this last year, the top 19 richest people in the world collectively added $1 trillion to their wealth. I think 19 people is like the first 3 rows here, okay? The top 19 people in our country added $1 trillion to their wealth. In that same year, 2 to 4 million people lost their SNAP benefits. 40% of whom were children, our children. Right? So if we do the math here, the SNAP cuts that are going to be rolled out over the next 10 years, it's $186 billion over 10 years. So around $18 billion a year, which means that 19 people gained in 1 year 54 times the amount of money that it would take to feed 2 to 4 million people, 40% of whom are children, right? So the question is not if there's enough money to feed the mouths, right? The question is, whose hands is that money going to be in, right? They just approved a pay package for Elon Musk that's essentially on track to make him, at one point, the world's first trillionaire. That salary, that amount of money, would mean that he is paid more than every teacher in America, every cashier in America, every cook in America, every farm worker in America, every bartender in America combined. Let's zoom out. How about we look at the world for a second? There are departments and programs within the UN that look at food insecurity and are essentially working towards solving world hunger. And there are estimates that if $30 to $40 billion per year over the next 5 years were spent strategically in the right places, that we could end world hunger. I'll say that again. $30 to $40 billion a year between now and 2030 could effectively end severe food insecurity on this planet. $30 to $40 billion a year. Meanwhile, it is estimated that our global holiday spending this year alone will be $1 trillion, right? So if just 3 to 4% of our annual global holiday spending was spent towards feeding the hungry, we could save millions, countless lives. Here's the illustration. Here's the point, friends. I don't think this is a resource issue. I think the issue is that the system is broken. The system is rigged against the most vulnerable. And this, perhaps, is the real spiritual sickness of our time, right? Not what you believe, which so often this is the issue that we're pitted against. What do you believe? Right, but maybe the spiritual sickness of our time is where we are placing our value and our worth, right? Where did Nick place value and worth? In human beings, in the ones who are most vulnerable. I want to read you a poem from poet David Gate. This poem is called Insatiable, and it goes like this. The most difficult part of helping the poor is not calling for the hungry to be fed, but for the wealthy to be content. I'll say it again. The most difficult part of helping the poor is not calling for the hungry to be fed, but for the wealthy to be content. You thought because I was wearing this sweater, I was going to go soft today, right? Here's the thing, friends. I'm not here to ruin your Christmas. I'm really not. My hope is to deepen it, right? I say yes to joy and to peace. And I say yes to watching Home Alone at some point in the next month, right? 1 or 2. You can't watch both in a single year. That's my rule. You got to pick one. Yes to all of that. But also yes to confronting the real spiritual bankruptcy of our time, right? Now, look, you might come to Aldea and you might think, well, look, I come to be inspired and I come for a spiritual, contemplative thing. I come really, I don't want to get into what's going on in our world. I don't want to get into the sort of quote unquote political things of this world. I want just to focus primarily on spirituality. And I get that, I love you, but I want to say something now because this is really an indication of where we are going for the next couple of weeks. And I want to just be really clear with you, right? If you want a spirituality that allows you to turn a blind eye to a system, right, that ultimately robs the poor and the vulnerable of their dignity, right, to a system that allows an ever-widening gap between the rich and the poor. If you want a spiritual life or a spirituality that affirms you turning a blind eye to a system that is slowly killing our planet, then friends, you can keep that spirituality. I don't want that kind of spirituality. Because the political has spiritual roots. Until we see all people and all beings and all life as divine and sacred and valuable, we will be living in a broken system. We will be living in a system where the leaders of the most powerful places in the world can address the nation on national television, calling certain ethnic groups garbage. This is why I think the Jesus story is incredibly radical in this time. However you choose to hold this story, because it's really a story about the Creator entering into humanity, specifically into a family, into a body that was poor, that was an immigrant, right? And in Christian tradition, this is called the incarnation, kind of a churchy religious word. But perhaps true incarnation is when we see the divine in all things, in all beings. Dorothy Day once said that what we're taught from the incarnation is a God that enters into our broken political world, not to bless the status quo, but to disrupt it. So, look, I don't care what you call it. You can call it economic, you can call it political, you can call it how we arrange ourselves, how we organize. But friends, the spiritual is political and the political is spiritual. And the spiritual is about love and compassion. Richard Rohr said that when we remember St. Nicholas, we remember that Christmas is not about consumption, but incarnation, love taking flesh in the form of compassion. This Christmas, I invite you to reframe. Maybe when you sing Joy to the World, right? It's not just about joy for a moment. When you sing Let There Be Peace on Earth, maybe it's not just about peace for an evening. But maybe we're also saying that may the systems that inhibit the peace and joy and well-being of all people, may we confront those. May we reimagine those. May we fight for, believe in, have faith and hope in something that would bring wholeness for all people. And frankly, if that's what Santa Claus stood for, then I'm okay with him kissing mommy once a year. You might be out there and you might feel overwhelmed at all that's going on in the world, overwhelmed at the state of what I even chose to present today. And I think one of the best ways that we can actually ground ourselves in the here and now is to try to embody that energy and that love that St. Nicholas had, which is one of humility, right? He didn't care about the fanfare or the platform of it. He cared about those who were in need. It reminds me of that Mr. Rogers quote, look for the helpers, right? When you're looking at the immensity of the world's problems, Mr. Rogers said, just look for the helpers, right? Look for those who are involved in the actual work. Look for the St. Nics right in front of you. Friends, right? May we move forward in this holiday season with peace and joy and love, but may we be open, right, to see things in a new way, to see the real Santa Claus at the heart of the story.